Daniel was used to long flights in empty space. As a cargo pilot, he had spent years moving crates, supplies, and passengers from one station to another. Most of the time, his work was lonely and quiet. He didn't complain. Space was a silent friend to him, a place where he could escape noise and crowds. But he had never been as truly alone as he was now. The transport ship, the Silver Path, was not large. It could carry a few dozen passengers and crates at best, but on this particular run, Daniel had been contracted to deliver something unusual, a single passenger from a faraway alien colony. The passenger had been placed in a sealed pod, a stasis chamber that would keep her safe during the trip. Daniel hadn't asked many questions. He was paid to fly, not to pry into politics or cultural exchanges. The flight had been smooth for the first 3 days. The stars stretched endlessly around him, blinking like cold diamonds against black velvet. Daniel followed the usual routes, sipping his rationed coffee, making small repairs here and there. Then everything went wrong. It began with a warning light on his console. At first he thought it was just a minor malfunction, a loose circuit, maybe a false alarm. But within minutes the entire ship shuddered violently. He gripped the controls, but the Silver Path was caught in a sudden storm of debris, small fragments of rock and ice, leftovers from a wandering asteroid belt. They struck the hull like bullets, each impact rattling his teeth. Hold together, Daniel muttered, steering the ship with all the focus he had. The shields flickered. The engine screamed. The systems began shutting down one by one. Sparks flew across the cockpit as panels overloaded. Daniel tried to reroute power, but the ship refused to listen. With a deafening crack, the main engine gave out, throwing the ship into a slow spin across the empty dark. For a long moment, Daniel just sat there, his breath loud in his helmet. He quickly checked the damage report. It was worse than he imagined. Life support was running on backup, communications were destroyed, and the engines were beyond repair without a full station dock. They were adrift. Daniel closed his eyes, steadying himself. He wasn't alone, though. There was still the alien passenger in the sealed pod. He pulled himself out of the pilot's chair and pushed down the narrow corridor toward the cargo bay. The lights flickered dimly, and he could hear the faint hum of failing systems. The pod was still intact. Frost clung to its glass surface, and inside, the alien girl lay still, suspended in stasis. Daniel wiped the glass, staring at her face, for the first time. She looked young, about his age, maybe a little younger. Her skin had a faint bluish tint, smooth and almost luminous under the icy light. Her long hair floated gently in the liquid inside the pod, silver strands that caught the glow. She wore a simple travel garment marked with symbols he couldn't read. Daniel exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure what species she was. There were dozens of alien races known to the colonies, but she looked fragile, like someone who had never known hardship. He checked the pod's systems. Power was failing here too. In a few hours, the chamber would shut down. If that happened, the girl would not survive. Daniel hesitated. He wasn't trained for this. He was a pilot, not a diplomat, not a caretaker. But the choice was simple: either leave her to die in the pod or bring her out and take his chances. With trembling hands, he pressed the release. The pod hissed as liquid drained, and the glass cover slid open. The alien girl gasped, choking as she drew her first breath outside the chamber. Daniel reached forward, steadying her as she weakly pushed herself upright. Her eyes opened, large, bright, and glowing faintly with a strange violet hue. She looked around in confusion, then fixed her gaze on Daniel. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered something in a soft, melodic language he didn't understand. Daniel raised his hands slowly, showing no harm. "You're safe," he said gently, though he knew she couldn't understand him. "The ship, we've got a problem. Big problem." The girl tilted her head, her expression uncertain. She shivered in the cold air, and Daniel quickly grabbed a thermal blanket from the storage rack. He wrapped it around her, trying not to seem threatening. "Daniel," he said, pointing at himself. Danielle. The girl blinked, then touched her chest. Lyra. He repeated it slowly. Lyra. Her lips curved slightly. Her first small smile. The silence of the ship returned, broken only by the faint hum of dying power. Daniel guided Lyra toward the cockpit, though she stumbled at first, her legs unsteady after so long in stasis. She clung to his arm, and though she didn't speak his language, she seemed to understand his urgency. When they reached the cockpit, Daniel showed her the broken systems, the flashing red lights, the frozen controls, the empty stars outside, the window. He pointed to the dead engines and then to himself, shaking his head. No power, no way home. Lyra studied the controls with wide eyes. She touched a few buttons, frowned, and muttered something under her breath. Then she pulled a small device from her belt, a crystal-shaped tool that glowed faintly. She pressed it against a panel, and to Daniel's surprise, some of the readings flickered back to life. Not much, but enough to give a glimmer of hope. You know this? Daniel asked, surprised. Lyra looked at him, tilting her head again, as though trying to piece together his meaning. Then she nodded, pressing her hand against her chest with a proud little gesture. Daniel laughed softly despite the situation. Guess you're not just a passenger, huh? The days ahead were going to be hard. They were stranded with only limited supplies and no guarantee of rescue. But Daniel felt a strange calmness as he looked at Lyra. She was alive. She wasn't panicking. And somehow, despite being strangers from different worlds, they were in this together now. For the first time since the accident, Daniel didn't feel entirely alone. The first night after the accident was the longest Daniel had ever endured. The ship floated silently through the void, its emergency lights casting a dim orange glow over the narrow corridors. The air smelled faintly of burned circuits and metal dust. Daniel tried to sleep in the pilot's chair, but every creak of the hull, every flicker of the dying power made him sit up, alert. Across from him, Lyra curled under the thermal blanket, her violet eyes half closed. She seemed calm, but Daniel knew she must be frightened. He had seen enough passengers wake from stasis to know how disorienting it was. Yet she didn't complain, didn't panic. She simply sat near him, watching him work, as though waiting for a sign of what would happen next. Daniel sighed and rubbed his temples. He had to think clearly. Supplies were limited, enough food and water for maybe 2 weeks if rationed strictly. Oxygen was holding steady, though the filters needed maintenance. The real problem was communication. With the transmitter destroyed, they had no way to call for help. Without engines, they couldn't reach the nearest trade route. He looked at Lyra. She noticed his stare and tilted her head. Problem, Daniel said, pointing to the dead console. Big problem. Lyra frowned, then touched her crystal-shaped tool again. It glowed faintly, and she waved it over the console. Some of the readings flickered, but most remained dead. She muttered something in her language and shook her head. Daniel chuckled softly. Yeah, exactly. Dead as a rock. She didn't understand his words, but she seemed to understand his tone. A small smile tugged at her lips, the kind that made the heavy silence feel lighter. The next day, Daniel decided they needed structure if they were going to survive. He divided the remaining food packs into small portions. He explained with gestures, showing Lyra how much they could eat each day. She nodded, repeating the gesture back to him, and even added a small mark on the wall with a tool from her belt. Her way of counting days. Daniel was surprised. She wasn't just following along, she was actively helping. When he moved to check the oxygen filters, Lyra followed. She crouched beside him, studying the tubes and vents. Daniel showed her how clogged they were with dust. She frowned, then carefully used her crystal tool to vibrate the dust loose. It was strange to watch, like the tool resonated at a frequency that shook debris free. Within minutes, the filters were cleaner than Daniel could have managed with. His clumsy hands, not bad, Daniel said, impressed. Lyra looked at him, her violet eyes sparkling, and tapped her chest proudly. "Lyra." He laughed. "Yeah, Lyra, you're full of surprises." Days passed slowly in the drifting ship. Daniel found himself talking to her more and more, even though she didn't always understand. He would point to objects and say their names: food, water, ship, star. She repeated the words, her accent soft and musical. Sometimes she laughed when she mispronounced them, covering her mouth shyly. In return, she taught him some of her words. Her language was flowing, filled, with sounds he had trouble making. But he tried, and every time he got close, her smile widened. Slowly, they built a small bridge of shared words, enough to exchange basic thoughts. One evening, as they shared a meal of ration bars, Daniel pointed out the window to a cluster of stars. "Constellation," he said, tracing the shape with his finger. "We call it the Archer." Lyra tilted her head, then whispered something in her tongue. She traced the same stars but connected them differently, forming a circle. She placed her hand over her heart and repeated the word softly. "Vena." Daniel tried to copy it. "Ve-na." Her smile grew, her eyes bright. She nodded eagerly, clapping her hands once. Daniel found himself laughing. Somehow, in the middle of danger and despair, he was enjoying these small lessons. Not everything was easy. The ship was falling apart more each day. The lights flickered so often that they had to carry lanterns. Temperature control was failing, and sometimes Daniel woke shivering under his blanket. Once, a water pipe burst, spraying across the corridor. Daniel panicked, thinking they'd lose their supply, but Lyra quickly sealed the crack with her tool, leaving behind a thin layer of hardened crystal. He stared at it, amazed. "You really are saving us," he said softly. She tilted her head, not understanding, but she reached out and touched his arm lightly. Her touch was gentle, reassuring. It was strange, Daniel thought. 2 weeks ago, he had never met her. Now she felt like the only thing keeping him sane. One night, Daniel woke to the sound of humming. At first, he thought it was a system alarm, but when he opened his eyes, he saw Lyra sitting near the viewport, humming softly in her language. Her voice was clear and calm, filling the silence of the ship with warmth. She looked out at the stars, then noticed Daniel watching. She pointed to the window. "Vena," she whispered again. Then she pointed to herself. "Lyra." Daniel nodded slowly. "Stars." "Lyra." She hesitated, then pointed at him. "Daniel." For a moment, their eyes met, and Daniel felt something shift inside him. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was comforting. Still, the shadow of danger never left. On the 7th day, Daniel discovered that one of the power cells had cracked. Without it, even the emergency systems would soon die. He sat on the floor of the engine room, his head in his hands. "We're done," he muttered. "This is it." Lyra crouched beside him, frowning as she studied the broken cell. She placed her hand over his, gently moving them aside. Then she pressed her crystal tool to the crack. Slowly, carefully, she hummed in her language, the same tone she had used when singing by the window. To Daniel's astonishment, the crack began to seal with glowing crystal. Within minutes, the power cell looked whole again. Daniel blinked in disbelief. "You fixed it?" Lyra exhaled, tired but smiling. "Together," she said, using one of the few words they had learned in common. Daniel laughed in relief. "Yeah, together." That night, as they shared their tiny meal, Daniel realized something. He had expected fear, despair, maybe even hopelessness from being stranded. Instead, he felt a strange sense of calm. He wasn't alone anymore. Lyra was curious, brave, and resourceful. She asked questions with her eyes, and even without words, she seemed to understand him better than most humans he had flown with. Every day they survived felt less like an accident and more like fate pushing them together. And though Daniel would never admit it out loud, a small part of him wondered if rescue never came. Would that really be the worst thing? The days blended together, marked only by the scratches on the wall that Daniel and Lyra used to count time. The ship drifted endlessly, carried by currents of the void, while the two unlikely companions worked tirelessly to keep it alive. Daniel had always thought of himself as practical. He lived by schedules, by repairs, by duties. But now, each day felt like a gamble. Every system on the ship was fragile, and every problem they solved only revealed another waiting to strike. Yet strangely, he didn't feel the crushing despair he had expected. It was because of her. Lyra was different. She brought a quiet determination with her, something that balanced Daniel's worry. Where he muttered in frustration, she hummed softly as she worked. Where he cursed broken wires, she smiled faintly and tried again with her glowing crystal. It was like she carried a small piece of light with her, and Daniel found himself depending on it more and more. One morning, if such a word even applied in the endless dark, Daniel woke to a low alarm. The red light above his head blinked steadily, a warning that made his heart pound. He jumped from the pilot's chair and checked the console. His stomach sank. "Radiation spike," he muttered. The silver path had drifted dangerously close to a dying star, a red giant on the verge of collapse. Its radiation pulsed outward in waves, invisible but deadly. The shields were too weak to block it. At best, they had hours before exposure would begin to poison the air and systems. He pressed his palms against the console, trying to think. No, not now. Lyra appeared behind him, her silver hair falling around her face, her violet eyes sharp with concern. She pointed to the blinking red light, then to the window, asking without words what it meant. Daniel turned to her, his voice heavy. "Star. Bad. Dangerous." He pointed at the warning symbol, then placed his hand over his chest and coughed. Her eyes widened. She understood. They had to act. Daniel pulled out the emergency schematics, spreading them across the floor. Lyra knelt beside him, her fingers tracing the lines with curiosity. He explained with gestures. The engines were dead, but maybe, just maybe, they could cannibalize what was left of the secondary thrusters to power a small distress beacon. If they could boost the signal, even weakly, there was a chance someone would pick it up. Lyra listened closely, her head nodding as she followed his explanation. Then she looked at him with sudden determination and tapped her crystal tool against the beacon's circuit lines. A faint spark ran along the schematics, as if she was already planning how to connect her alien tech with his broken human machines. Daniel smiled weakly. "You really don't give up, do you?" The work was brutal. The beacon was buried in the guts of the ship, connected to half-dead systems that were never meant to be touched. Daniel pried open panels, his hands raw from scraping against jagged metal. Sparks bit at his fingers as he twisted wires together. Beside him, Lyra worked with quiet focus. She used her tool to fuse broken circuits, sealing gaps with fine layers of crystal that pulsed faintly. When Daniel's tools failed, her alien device succeeded. When her arms trembled with exhaustion, Daniel held the panel steady for her. Hours passed. They spoke little, but their silence was not empty. It was filled with the rhythm of shared effort, the clang of metal, the hum of her crystal, the grunt of Daniel's strained muscles. Sometimes, Daniel caught her watching him. Her eyes lingered, not just curious but thoughtful, almost warm. He pretended not to notice, but the heat of her gaze stayed with him even as he worked. By the time they paused to eat, both were drenched in sweat and dust. Daniel handed her a ration bar and she accepted it gratefully. They sat side by side in the dim corridor, chewing in silence. Finally, Lyra pointed at the beacon components laid out before them. She lifted her hand, clenched her fist, then opened it slowly, like light spreading. "Hope," she said softly, repeating one of the words Daniel had taught her. Daniel froze. She had never used that word before. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her silver hair clung to her cheeks, her violet eyes glowing faintly in the half-light, her posture weary but proud. She was trying to speak his words, trying to give him courage. His chest tightened. "Yeah," he whispered. Hope. The next day brought setbacks. A power surge burned out half the circuits they had repaired. Daniel slammed his fist against the wall, his patience breaking. "We're never going to make this work," he shouted, his voice raw. Lyra flinched at his anger but didn't back away. Instead, she crouched before him, lifting his chin gently so he met her gaze. "Together," she whispered. Daniel's shoulders sagged. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying a strength he hadn't realized she possessed. He nodded slowly, shame cooling his frustration. "Together," he echoed. So they tried again. As they worked, Daniel found himself speaking more, even if she didn't understand every word. He told her about his home, about the small colony where he grew up, about the quiet nights in the cargo lanes when the only sound was the hum of the ship. He confessed that sometimes he had felt invisible, just another pilot, just another name on a roster. Lyra listened, her eyes never leaving his face. She didn't interrupt. Sometimes she would reach out, touching his hand lightly, as if to say she understood even without words. And slowly she began to share too, not with human words but with gestures, expressions, and her own language. She drew shapes on the floor with her finger, patterns of stars, circles that meant home, lines that meant travel. She tapped her chest and spoke names he couldn't follow, but he understood they were people she had loved, people she had left behind. Daniel realized something then. They weren't just surviving, they were learning each other. On the 10th day, they finally managed it. The beacon flickered to life, weak but steady, sending its signal into the void. Daniel and Lyra stood side by side, watching the small light blink on the console. Daniel let out a breathless laugh. "It's working! We did it!" Lyra's eyes shone with triumph. She reached for his hand without hesitation, squeezing it tightly. "Hope," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. Daniel's heart skipped. He squeezed her hand back, unable to speak for a moment. They weren't safe yet. The star's radiation still pulsed and rescue was far from guaranteed. But for the first time since the accident, Daniel felt the weight in his chest lift. They had taken their fate into their own hands. That night, as they rested by the viewport, Daniel caught himself staring at her again. She sat close, wrapped in her blanket, her eyes reflecting the stars outside. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, knowing she wouldn't understand. She turned to him, tilting her head. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she whispered, one word, her accent gentle but clear. "Daniel." He blinked, surprised. She had said his name before, but this time it was different. It wasn't just recognition. It was something deeper, filled with meaning he couldn't quite grasp. He smiled faintly, warmth spreading through him. "Yeah, I'm here." And in the silent drift of the void, surrounded by danger and uncertainty, Daniel realized something. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was changing. The beacon blinked steadily, sending its faint cry into the endless dark. For Daniel and Lyra, that small light felt like a lifeline. It meant they had a chance. It meant someone, somewhere, might hear them. But the void was wide, and hope was fragile. Daniel tried to stay positive, but each day that passed without an answer weighed heavier on his heart. He didn't tell Lyra how low the power reserves were running, or how thin the oxygen levels were beginning to feel. She didn't need the worry. She already carried enough on her shoulders. Still, he found strength in her presence. Lyra never complained. She hummed softly as she worked, her voice calming, her hands steady as she repaired panels and wires with her strange crystal tool. She had a patience Daniel often lacked. And when he faltered, when fear crept into his chest, she would touch his arm or meet his gaze, reminding him silently that he wasn't fighting alone. Then came the surge. It started as a low vibration, a deep hum running through the ship's bones. Daniel sat up in the cockpit, frowning as warning lights flared across the console. The radiation levels spiked again, brighter and stronger than before. The failing power cells strained under the stress. "Not good," he muttered. "Not good. At all." The hum became a roar as the backup reactor overloaded. Sparks shot from the floor panels. Lyra stumbled into the cockpit, eyes wide with alarm. She shouted in her language, pointing at the flashing red lights. Daniel grabbed her shoulders, steadying her. "Reactor," he said quickly, pointing toward the engine room. He held his hands apart, then slammed them together, mimicking an explosion. She understood immediately. Her face went pale. They raced down the corridor, the walls trembling around them. The reactor chamber door glowed faintly, heat radiating through the metal. Daniel tried to override the lock, but the console sparked violently. "Of course," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Nothing works when you need it." Lyra stepped forward, pressing her crystal tool against the lock. With a sharp hum, the door slid open, revealing the chaos inside. The reactor pulsed wildly, its core flaring with unstable energy. Cracks glowed along its surface and cables whipped like snakes as the ship shook. Daniel shielded his eyes from the heat. "We need to stabilize it," he shouted, though he knew Lyra couldn't understand every word. She didn't need to. She nodded firmly and ran to one side of the chamber, her movements quick and precise. Daniel pulled open a panel, his hands shaking as he forced wires into place. Every spark burned his skin, but he ignored the pain. Across the chamber, Lyra placed her crystal against the reactor's surface, chanting softly in her language. The crystal glowed brighter, resonating with the reactor's energy. For a moment, Daniel thought it might work. The wild pulses slowed, the reactor's light dimming slightly. Hope flickered in his chest. Then another surge ripped through the system. The blast threw Daniel to the floor, his ears ringing. He looked up to see the reactor cracking wider, the glow blinding. "No, no, no." He scrambled to his feet, panic clawing at him. Lyra staggered too, clutching her crystal. Her violet eyes blazed with determination as she shouted something in her language, pointing at the top of the reactor. Daniel followed her gesture and saw it. A control valve, half buried in cables, leaking unstable energy. It was their only chance. Daniel didn't hesitate. He climbed the side of the reactor chamber, pulling himself up with shaking arms. The heat seared his skin, but he pressed forward. Sparks rained down on him as he reached the valve. Come on," he muttered, gripping the wheel. He twisted with all his strength, but it barely moved. His muscles screamed in protest. Below, Lyra placed her crystal against the reactor again, her voice rising louder, steady and clear. The resonance spread, slowing the wild pulses. The reactor's light dimmed slightly, giving Daniel the moment he needed. With a final roar, he twisted the valve shut. The reactor shuddered, then slowly calmed. The chamber grew quiet. The light faded to a steady glow. The danger passed. Daniel slid down the reactor wall, collapsing to the floor, his chest heaving. Sweat dripped into his eyes, his arms trembling with exhaustion. For a moment, he simply sat there, catching his breath. Lyra knelt beside him, her face pale but her eyes shining. She touched his arm gently, then pointed to the reactor. "Safe," she whispered, using one of the words he had taught her. Daniel laughed weakly. "Yeah, safe, for now." Without thinking, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Her fingers were warm against his, steadying him as much as he steadied her. In the days that followed, they worked to reinforce the repairs. Daniel rigged makeshift supports around the reactor, while Lyra used her crystal to seal the cracks more permanently. It was exhausting, but they managed it. The reactor remained stable, humming quietly in the background instead of roaring with chaos. When they finally rested side by side in the dim corridor, Daniel realized how close they had grown. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was filled with unspoken trust. He glanced at her, at the way her silver hair caught the faint light, at the softness in her violet eyes when she looked back at him. He felt his chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with something he couldn't quite name. One evening, as they sat by the viewport, Lyra broke the silence. She pointed at the beacon light on the console, still blinking weakly. Then she turned to Daniel, her expression serious. "Rescue?" she asked, her accent careful. Daniel hesitated, unsure how to answer. He wanted to give her hope, but the truth was, they didn't know if anyone had heard. "Maybe," he said softly. "I hope so." Lyra studied him, then nodded slowly. She didn't press further. Instead, she reached for his hand again, holding it quietly as they stared out at the stars together. For Daniel, that simple gesture said more than words ever could. The next challenge came unexpectedly. The strain of the reactor surge had damaged other parts of the ship, systems Daniel hadn't checked yet. The temperature controls flickered, dropping the air around them to freezing levels. Daniel shivered as he pulled his jacket tighter, his breath visible in the cold air. Lyra, too, wrapped herself in the blanket, her lips pale, but instead of despair, she began to hum again. The same soft song she had sung on the first nights after her stasis pod. Her voice was calm, carrying warmth even in the cold. Daniel closed his eyes, listening. Somehow, her song made the cold easier to bear. "You're something else, Lyra," he whispered. Her humming paused and she looked at him, tilting her head. Then she smiled faintly and touched her chest. "Lyra." Daniel chuckled softly. "Yeah, Lyra." They didn't know if rescue would come. They didn't know if the beacon's signal was strong enough or if their repairs would last. But they knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And in the dark silence of the broken transport, Daniel realized something he had never thought possible. He no longer feared the void, not when she was there beside him. The beacon continued to blink, its soft rhythm the only proof of their efforts. Daniel watched it often, hoping, almost praying that someone would notice. Each blink felt like a heartbeat, steady, patient, alive. But days stretched into a week, and still no answer came. Daniel tried not to let his worry show. He worked on the filters, rationed their food, checked the reactor over and over. But when he was alone, fear gnawed at him. What if no one came? What if they drifted forever in the empty dark? It was Lyra who kept him steady. She never let silence turn to despair. She hummed her songs, taught him new words in her language, and laughed softly when he mispronounced them. Sometimes she would draw patterns on the floor with her finger, showing him the way her people saw the stars. Other times, she would simply sit beside him, her shoulder against his, a quiet reminder that he was not facing the void alone. On the 12th day after the beacon was activated, Daniel was half asleep in the cockpit when a soft beep startled him awake. His eyes flew to the console. A signal, faint but real, was coming through. His heart leapt. "Someone's out there," he whispered. Lyra stirred from her blanket, blinking sleepily. Daniel pointed at the console, excitement breaking through. His exhaustion. "Rescue!" he shouted, the word clear and strong. Her eyes widened. She repeated softly, "Rescue?" "Yes." Daniel laughed louder than he had in weeks. "Rescue." The signal was weak, filled with static, but it was enough. Someone had heard them. The next hours were a blur of activity. Daniel adjusted, the ship's position as best he could, trying to strengthen the beacon's reach. Lyra helped, her hand steady as she tuned circuits with her crystal tool. Together, they poured every last bit of energy into making sure the signal stayed alive. Finally, through the haze of static, a voice broke through. "This is Patrol Cruiser Aegis. We have received your signal. Hold position. We are on approach." Daniel's throat tightened. His eyes burned as relief washed over him. "Thank you," he whispered. Lyra, though she didn't understand the words, saw his expression and smiled. She touched his arm gently, her eyes shining. She knew. When the cruiser finally appeared, a speck of light growing larger against the endless black, Daniel felt his chest ache with relief. He hadn't realized until that moment how much tension he had been carrying. The Aegis docked carefully with the broken transport. Rescue crews in clean uniforms flooded aboard, their voices loud and certain, a stark contrast to the quiet isolation Daniel and Lyra had shared. "You're lucky," one of them told Daniel as they checked his vitals. "Another day and your oxygen would have run dry." Daniel nodded numbly, his eyes drifting toward Lyra. She stood close to him, wrapped in the blanket, her violet eyes wide as she looked at the humans around her. She didn't flinch, but her hand reached for his instinctively, gripping it tightly. He squeezed back, silently promising he wouldn't let her be swept away. On the cruiser, Daniel was given clean clothes, hot food, and water that didn't taste, recycled. But even as comfort returned, he felt strangely restless. He kept glancing around, searching for Lyra. He found her in the medical bay, surrounded by curious crew members. They spoke gently, trying to communicate, but she looked uncomfortable, her gaze darting toward the door. When she saw Daniel, her expression softened with visible relief. She reached for him without hesitation. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself at her side. "She's with me," he said firmly. The crew exchanged glances but didn't argue. Over the next few days, the cruiser carried them toward the nearest star station. Daniel should have felt joy, but instead he felt a knot forming in his chest. He knew what would happen when they arrived. Lyra would be taken back to her people. He would return to his old life as a pilot. The thought made his chest ache. One evening, as the ship glided through space, Daniel stood by the viewport, staring at the stars. He heard soft footsteps behind him. Lyra joined him, her blanket draped around her shoulders. For a long moment they stood in silence, watching the stars together as they always had. Then Lyra turned to him. "Daniel," she said softly. He looked at her. She pointed toward herself. "Lyra." Then she pointed to him. "Daniel." Her voice trembled slightly as she added another word they had shared. "Together?" Daniel's heart skipped. He swallowed hard, searching her eyes. She wasn't asking about repairs or survival. This time, she was asking about something deeper. He reached out, gently taking her hand. "Together," he whispered. Her smile was small but filled with warmth. When the cruiser reached the star station, officials were waiting. They thanked Daniel for his survival efforts and promised to handle Lyra's safe return. But when they tried to lead her away, she resisted. Her hand tightened on Daniel's arm, her violet eyes fierce. One of the officials frowned. "She belongs with her people. This is a matter of cultural exchange." "No," Daniel said firmly. "She's not cargo, she's not a package to be delivered, she's a person, and she chooses." The official looked surprised. "Chooses?" Daniel turned to Lyra. "It's your choice," he said softly, though he wasn't sure how much she understood. She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering. Slowly, clearly, she spoke in halting human words. "I stay. Daniel. Together." The official blinked in shock. Daniel, however, felt his chest fill with warmth. It wasn't easy. There were arguments, questions, and more than a few disapproving looks. But in the end, Lyra's choice was respected. She stayed with Daniel. Their lives would not be simple. They came from different worlds, different languages, different stars. But they had already faced despair together. They had already survived. The silence of the void, side by side. Daniel no longer feared being alone in space. He no longer saw himself as just another pilot, because now when he looked at the stars, he didn't see emptiness. He saw possibility, and every time Lyra slipped her hand into his, every time she whispered his name with that soft musical accent, he knew one thing for certain. They had been alone on a broken transport once, but now they would face whatever came next, together.